Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Without further ado, let me tell you a little bit about my guest today. Dr. Will Keepin Ph.D. is the co-founder of the Satyana Institute and the Gender Reconciliation International Project, which has organized more than 100 workshops and trainings in 9 countries for social healing between women and men. He has studied and practiced intensively in Eastern and European spiritual disciplines for 35 years and immersed himself in contemplative practices from the Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and Sufi traditions. Yeah, my kind of guy. Dr. Keepin is a mathematical physicist, a social activist, an environmental scientist whose research on sustainable energy and global warming influence international environmental policy. He was a whistleblower in nuclear science policy and presented testimony to the U.S. House of Representatives and the parliaments of Australia and several European countries. He holds a Ph.D. in applied mathematics, an MS in mathematical physics, MA in East-West psychology, and an honorary doctorate in spirituality and social change. His latest book, Belonging to God, is a vast exploration of divine love in Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, as seen through the scriptures and the writings of leading mystics from these traditions, that presents a glorious universal path of love that is illuminated equally by modern science and ancient wisdom. Welcome to the show, Dr. Will Keepin. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, Bernard, and it's a privilege to be on the show. Thank you.
And it's a privilege to have you. Thank you for joining us. I've been looking forward to this because we seem to have very similar interests. And I'm looking forward to picking your brain for the next hour. With that being said, should we call you Dr. Keepin or William or Will?
Just call me Will. That's
Will.
what I
Okay, well, my roommate's name is Will, so I like that.
Okay, great.
Excuse me, Will. What I always like to ask new guests who's never been on the show, what is it that drew you to this path of study? I mean, you have a wonderful, I guess, polymathic background of interconnecting physics with spirituality. What drew you and called you to do this type of work in spirituality?
I began from a young age feeling the importance of love. I remember when I graduated from high school, the summer after I graduated from high school, I read a beautiful little book called The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm, which, you may recall that book. And I decided, based on the beauty of what he was teaching in that book, that I would go to college and major in psychology, because my skills were in science, but my heart was into love. And I thought, well, this is great. Well, I'll go to study psychology and I'll learn all about the nature of human beings and love and everything. Well, of course, when I got to college, it was behaviorism being taught as if it were sort of the inviolable laws of physics. And I was so offended by the shallowness of it. I remember thinking, even I, as an 18-year-old young man, can see how completely empty and betraying of the deeper dignity of the human being this teaching is. I couldn't believe it. And so in my youthful sort of, rashness, I just blew off psychology, dropped the major, and went into physics and math, where I felt it's not as interesting, but at least it's not trying to be pretentiously profound when it isn't.
Very good.
And so I stayed with it. I mean, and I got into mathematics and physics, and I never took another psychology course again until I went back to graduate school, actually at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And at that point, I was in my late 30s, kind of retooling for a whole new career. And at that point, I was really working at this interface between science and spirituality and beginning to work in that domain in earnest. The other thing I'll tell you, just as a little personal story, is that my spiritual training began the instant that my secular training ended. I mean, literally, when I finished my PhD, which was in applied mathematics, applied to solutions of physics problems, I literally was turning in the dissertation. I'd been through the defense, all that business. I'm handing it to the secretary who's going to go file it, and I am now done. 25 years of constant schooling, from kindergarten to, forward. And now I'm finished, finally, with my formal training. And on the secretary's desk was this book by someone named Krishnamurti. And I sort of chuckled to myself like a good scientist, thinking, oh, I've heard of this. I know this is total flaky, religiosity or something. I was equating it with probably some of the Hare Krishnas I'd met on campus. I picked the book up. I started reading. I was blown away by Krishnamurti and what he was saying. And then I opened to another page, and same thing happened. And I was just kind of transfixed. And then, of course, I put the book down quickly so that the secretary wouldn't think that I'm rummaging through his materials while I'm on his desk in his absence. It's like, what are you up to, man? So I put the book down, and then I got on my bicycle, and instead of going out and, having a beer party, which I might have been doing in those days, as a graduate student, I rode to the bookstore, I bought that book, and I stayed up, until 3 a.m. reading it. And that really began my kind of formal spiritual training, in a sense.
Oh, wow. Oh, so it's fair to say this was kind of like a surprise to you, perhaps? Like maybe this like piqued your interest and kind of shifted your focus a little bit?
Well, I had come even in graduate school to begin to realize that physics it's not answering the deep questions of my heart.
Right.
And I knew that there was more to life than just what science was offering me, on the one hand. On the other hand, it was so compelling, studying quantum physics and relativity theory and electricity and magnetism, the beauty of the equations, the profundity of what they are and have discovered and are able to reveal, and the depth and care of deep thinking and searching that went into it was very, very inspiring and a very profound training as a young man. But what happened for me when it really began to unravel was when I entered the practical world of science and began to find, as Einstein put it so beautifully, he said, if you take the temple of science and you remove those who have, a personal agenda, an egotistical agenda, a political or economic agenda, and you take those folks out of the temple, you're only left with 2 or 3 standing, and those are the real scientists.
Yes.
Because those are the ones who are pursuing it for the sake of truth alone, which is always how I felt science should be. Science is really a pursuit of truth for its own sake. And that's what I wanted. And when I got into the politics of science and the reality of the everyday science, I found very few scientists who would meet me there. But fortunately, I did find a few and was mentored to some degree by them. One of them was David Bohm, the physicist David Bohm, who wrote Wholeness in the Implicate Order. And so I just continued my quest for science. And to summarize the answer to your question in a very short little kind of trajectory, I always saw science as a quest for truth. I then discovered that the greatest truth is love. And the deepest form of love is divine love. So in a sense, it's very natural that I went from science to the gender reconciliation to the interspiritual path of divine love, which is really kind of the core of my work now.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I really appreciate how you define science as the searching for truth. We have many, how should we say, alternative scientists and archaeologists and historians come on the show a lot, and they seem to say much of the same thing, that due to the empirical nature and or, like you said, the politics of it, sometimes the truth is lost because it doesn't relate to what is already known, which, for
Absolutely.
me, whether it be spirituality or what we call alchemy or magic or something like that, these are just parts of science that haven't quite been discovered yet, and we need to explore those aspects of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a vast science of the heart, as I like to say, the inner science, really the science of consciousness, which is in its absolute infancy. And traditional Western science has ignored this and has relegated consciousness to merely an epiphenomenon, they call it, a side effect of neurophysiology in the brain, which utterly trivializes it and really sidesteps the whole issue. That fortunately is finally beginning to change, but it's been centuries. There has
Yeah.
been this kind of materialist, really a dogma. What's happened is that science itself was a reaction to religious dogma in the 15th and 16th centuries, which really needed to happen because there was such a fundamentalist kind of dogma of the medieval scholasticism. Science was largely a reaction to that. Descartes' I think, therefore I am was a very important exit from that whole dogmatic authority of religion. But what's happened is that in many ways science has replaced that and become its own dogma, particularly the orthodox mainstream scientific worldview. So that needs to be unraveled.
Yeah. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Now, in your book, Will, and I believe you mentioned it already, you
Yes.
use the term interspirituality. What does that mean, and how are you applying it in this discussion in your book?
Yes. Well, we've had interfaith dialogue for some time as essentially an exchange across the religions of usually of the different theologies, different belief systems, and kind of intellectual frameworks and conceptual frameworks for the understanding of the divine, if you will. And interspirituality takes interfaith exchange and dialogue a very significant step forward, because what it does is it begins to bring forth the transformative practice and transformative journey of the soul and the psyche that takes place in spiritual traditions and in religions. And so when that begins to happen, there is a much deeper conversation that begins to happen across the faith traditions about the transformation process itself that happens as a result of entering into the depths of the religious life. And I use religion because I'm referring to the religions, but of course this exists also beyond the religions. It's a universal path of wisdom or of truth or of love, that they all eventually converge in this kind of transformation of consciousness in which the human consciousness is, if you will, replaced by a higher consciousness that it's said to descend, or whatever metaphorical term we use. As the Sufis put it, when truth enters the heart, it empties the heart of everything except itself. And so, in a sense, truth replaces the human being with itself. And then one becomes an instrument of truth and divine love and divine will. And that process is basically, essentially the same across the traditions, whether it's theistic traditions or non-theistic traditions. There is this essential transmutation of human consciousness into being an instrument for a higher wisdom and consciousness.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I can't help but think of a story. I remember Joseph Campbell was being interviewed by Bill Moyers, and he said he was telling a story of how he was at the New York Athletic Club swimming in a pool with one of the archbishops,
Right,
and he
right.
said, "But Mr. Campbell, don't you have faith?" He says, "I don't need faith. I have experience." And
Yes,
it's almost transcending the dogma of the religion
absolutely.
into the experiential aspect of it.
Absolutely. That's it right there.
Uh,
That's it beautifully.
and what can you say in reference to the teachings of all these different religions that you've been studying and or practicing or experiencing? The teachings on the path of divine love. What is shared and what is common within all these religions?
Well, thank you for that question. I feel like it's something that really needs to be articulated. First of all, there is a kind of contemporary bias that the path of love is somehow less than or inferior to the path of truth, um, and the path of knowledge. And this comes out of really a misunderstanding that love the path of love is inherently dualistic, because you begin by having in the heart love for the divine, love for God. So there's this fundamental separation. There's I here and there's God there, and I love God, or I give my love to God or to a deity. And it's true that this path does begin there with some form of devotional worship. But what happens in the process of transformation is that otherness of God is realized as the essence of oneself. And so then one becomes the object of one's devotion, and there is emergence into that object of devotion. And then eventually what happens is there is a complete oneness, as Meister Eckhart puts it, this I and that God become one is, and act as this isness in the world. And at that point, one has achieved the path of non-dual realization of God by realizing oneself as the very essence of God. Or to put it more accurately, the inmost essence of the human being is none other than the transcendent essence of the absolute Godhead. And this is true across the traditions, and I would submit also across the non-theistic traditions. In that, for example, in Buddhism, we have the three kayas, the Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, Dharmakaya. And Dharmakaya is the infinite kind of spacious awareness of the cosmic existence and non-existence. And one has that as the inmost essence of oneself as an aspiring Buddhist aspirant. And so realizing the Dharmakaya is equivalent to non-dual realization of God in the path, in the theistic traditions.
Right.
But to get there, what they have in common are certain fundamental practices. And what I've done is to go into the scriptures and the mystics of these traditions and to really find what are the deep parallels, what are the correspondences. And they fall into, I'd say, two or three categories. First is there is this emphasis on giving one's devotion, one's love, and one's full attention and being to this supreme mystery that we call God, or we could call it, ultimate reality. And that is found in common across the traditions. And the way that this love is expressed is through a process of giving one's very self, of essentially what is called surrender. And of course, surrender always has this quality that we don't like, especially in the West, of some kind of humbling defeat.
Yeah.
And giving up kind of feeling. And that's very unfortunate because it's really a joyful self-giving in the face of a supreme, majestic being that one comes into awareness of, and everything in oneself wants to then be in alignment with and to serve this being. That's the early and initial stages of this process. But there is this quality of surrender. And another term for it might be unconditional consent. This is the key, because we are given essentially free will. We can do as we choose. We can resist this process. And so what you find across the traditions is the need for this consenting, this allowing of that mystical transformation to take place in the human being. So that's a key piece. And then the second piece that comes right along with that is the replacement of one's personal desires or will with a larger, what's called divine will, for example, or thy will, in the Christian context, and is called the Dharma in a Buddhist context. One relinquishes one's own personal desires for a larger truth and wisdom to come through. And that's part of the natural surrender process. Those two, and then the third one is that this is usually experienced as a kind of death experience in the sense of what's called the mystic death, or in Islamic traditions, the Prophet Muhammad's saying that you must die before you die. Or in the case of Jesus, where he said, those who seek to save their lives shall lose it, but those who will lose their life for my sake shall save it. So it's this idea of actually giving up your sense, yourself, your ideas, your personality, your mind and thoughts, and really laying them at the altar of something so profound and infinite and extreme beyond the human being, and then discovering that other then takes up residence within you, and that's actually your true identity actually anyway.
Yes.
And that's what belonging to God means. It's that actually we never didn't belong to God. We are always in that oneness with God, but we're utterly unaware of it. And because we're unaware of it, we've developed essentially a false sense of who we are, a false identity, a false personality, and then we go through the world with that.
Yeah.
And that's all that dies. The only thing that dies is who we aren't. Who we are can never die, has never been dead, and cannot die. And that's what we discover. So the whole experience of the death, the so-called mystic death, is actually the death of the false self, which is the death of the unreal. So as it says in the Bhagavad Gita, the real has never not existed. There was never a time when you and I were not living, and nor shall there ever be a time when the unreal exists. And
I love
so
it.
you and I are eternal beings living in a mortal body, but the essence of who we are is eternal. And that discovery of that process is consistent across all of the religions.
Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more. I even within my own practices, I sense that connection with the higher self, so to speak. I firmly believe that it is in the alignment with the higher self that we
Yes.
we become, well, it's opening up the intuitive self, whatever it is you wish to call it, but it is, like you said, the true you, so to speak.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know if you want to take it somewhere else. I have a little more to add in terms of some of the specifics.
Oh,
But
please. We have about 4 more minutes on this segment, so by all
okay.
means.
Okay, well, the other thing that they have in common that I found that was so interesting was this process that in the Hindu tradition is called prakriti or sharanagati, which means to surrender. It specifically means to surrender, but in the Hindu tradition, it's spelled out with particularly in the Vaishnavite and the Sri Vaishnavite branch of Hinduism, it's spelled out in these 5 steps that are called angas. And the first one is to follow the will of God. And the second one is to do nothing that would displease God. So that's also following the will, but it's a very particular injunction not to displease God. Then the third one is to have absolute faith. You know, in Hindu, they have this word, in Sanskrit, they have this word shraddha, which is usually translated as faith, but it's really a deeper kind of faith. It is the inmost convictions of the heart. And basically, if you hold in your heart the conviction that you are a divine being and that this transformation is possible because you have been inspired by the greats, the great teachers of humanity who brought this message to us, who all brought the same message, which basically was, as the Quran says, there is no God but God. There is only the one God. So give your life and your worship and your devotion to this one God. And all of these traditions basically say this same thing. And when you have that really in your heart and mind and hold that as a conviction, you know it's true even though you haven't realized it, but that faith is what will carry you forward. That's the absolute faith. And then the fourth one is trust, entrusting oneself to this higher wisdom and knowledge, which after all, we entrust it with every breath. Who of us can analyze how the breath actually works? What goes on when you take that in breath and suddenly you receive that nourishment of life from who knows where? So we're living that faith every moment just to keep our body alive. But we need to also do that with our minds and our very being and entrust ourselves entirely to the divine. And then the fifth one is, with those 4 steps taken, then to offer oneself utterly and fully at the feet of this supreme mystery in an act of total surrender. And then what happens is the real spiritual journey begins.
Absolutely.
Because up till then, it's all preparation.
Excuse me, Will. We have a commercial break interrupting us right now.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
And welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We are the #1 listener-supported radio station in the world, and we are speaking with Dr. Will Keepin today about his new book, and I've got the cover right here. Let me show it to you for those that are watching. It's called Belonging to God. It's got a wonderful, I guess those are fractals on the cover, Will?
Yes, that's correct.
I love it. I love it. It's great. And with that being said, let's talk a little bit about the idea of fractals. Now, you brought that up in your book. What are fractals to those of us that don't actually know the definition of them?
Well, a fractal is essentially a mathematical geometric structure, which on the face of it might sound like, well, so what? What does that have to do with what we're talking about? But it has a very particular property in that if you blow up a part of the fractal, you find that the microstructure is identical to the macrostructure. And we also find that they exist throughout nature. So a simple example of a fractal in nature would be like a fern. If you look at a fern and you look at the structure and then you take just one leaf of that fern, you see that it has the same identical form as the great fern, the big fern itself. So the one little tiny leaflet off the fern is a miniature fern. And we see this throughout in Romanesque broccoli, if you know that type of broccoli, where it looks like the little nodule on the broccoli is a replica of the full broccoli itself.
Yeah.
And also tree branches have this structure. If you take one branch of the tree off of the tree and you blow it up and magnify it, you'll find that it looks identical to the trunk and its branches. So we find that fractal structures are throughout nature. The circulatory system is structured in this way. The trachea and the lungs are structured in this way. So living natural systems are structured by fractals. And mathematically, you can think of it as like something like a set of Russian dolls. You know, Russian dolls where you open the one and you find a smaller one in there, and you open that one, you find a smaller one in there. And mathematically, the fractal, that process goes on forever. And what I've done then in this book is to propose that consciousness also has this structure. And I'm not the first to suggest this. In fact, not at all. This is actually, and this is my assertion in the book, that fractals are actually a modern scientific discovery of an ancient principle from the ancient alchemists and the Hermetic tradition that was called the correspondence principle, which basically says that the microcosm replicates the macrocosm.
Yeah.
That each human being is a miniature replica of the entire cosmos. And there's this principle of correspondence that exists across every scale of the universe. And this is the amazing discovery that science is now beginning to make, but which the mystics have known for millennia.
It's the as within, so without, kind of like what the
That's
Emerald
correct.
Tablet
That's
talks
within,
about.
so without. As above, so below. Precisely that. Yes.
Exactly. Now, how does the fractal hypothesis or theory, how can that be applied in our daily religious practices, or I guess for the common person?
Well, it actually, first of all, there's just a certain recognition that it brings. So, for example, it unifies the different religions because you begin to see, oh, that's what they're talking about. So let's take the example, a few examples, like in Christianity, the statement from Jesus, I and the Father are one.
Yes.
Or that's a clear example. But there's another somewhat more accurate example where he says in John's Gospel, everything I have is yours. Everything you have is mine. Now, the idea that everything I have is yours, we know that. Each one of us, everything we have is already God's. We're created by God in some sense. Even if you call God if you believe in random chance, then you could call God as an acronym for the grand operational dice that are rolled in each moment of cosmic evolution.
Yeah.
You still belong to that process. So whatever it is, we didn't create ourselves. So whatever it is that created us, we are the fruit of that creation. And then, so the idea there is that we are one with that. That is the discovery that we are a miniature version of that supreme infinite mystery. And that's expressed in those statements by Jesus. Everything God has is ours. That part is the mystical revelation. For example, Meister Eckhart says so beautifully, he said, when the disciple is ready, and that means when the heart has been emptied of itself and is really purified, then God cannot help but pour God into your heart, and all of it. Just as the sun cannot help but shine through a clear sky. It can't stop itself. It just does it. And Meister Eckhart says that God pours all of his divinity, all of her majesty and divinity and justice and infinity into the heart of the purified heart of the devotee. So what this means is that in the depths of our heart, we can realize the full infinity of God. This is the amazing promise across the mystical traditions. So and that's the case for Christian. Now, if we go to Hinduism, we find Atman, which is the soul of the human being, is Brahman, which is the cosmic God herself or himself.
Hmm.
So we have this notion of Atman is Brahman. The two are identical. If we go to Islam, we have the great declaration by the Sufi saint Al-Hallaj, who said, An al-Haq, I am the supreme reality. And by the way, for that, he got the same treatment Jesus did. He was publicly executed in Baghdad, and he responded the same way. As they cut his body to pieces, he prayed for his executioners.
Oh.
But what you see, and even in the Psalms, that beautiful, famous line, be still and know what? Know that I am God. So we see across these traditions this identity of the inmost essence of the soul with the full infinity of God. How can that be? Well, fractals show us that, because if you take a fractal, like, for example, the Mandelbrot set's the most fundamental mathematical structure, and you zoom in on that set, you'll find embedded within it miniature replicas hundreds of millions of times smaller than the original set. And yet when you find that replica and you explore it, you find it has all of the complexity, all of the infinite intricacy of the original that's millions of times larger. So it's literally the case mathematically that the as above, so below is a literal truth of fractal mathematics. That miniature little one is identical and contains the full infinite complexity, richness, and intricacy of the original that's millions of times bigger. And what I'm saying is fractal mathematics is a special case of a larger divine principle of consciousness. It's a special case of this larger majestic reality of as above, so below. And that is what the mystics are talking about when they say I and God are one.
Ah, and isn't it a shame that we don't get taught these mystical theories and practices when we're being brought up in our particular religion, whatever it may be? It seems to me, at least in my knowledge of world religions and what I've studied over the years, that there's always a mystical aspect to most of the religion, but it seems to be hidden from the general public and the devotees that practice it. Why do you feel that is? Is it
That's
political?
really true, Bernard. Well, there's several levels of reason for that. Part of it is political. Part of it was deliberate attempt on the part of the power structures to hide it, because the true spiritual pathway is always direct through your heart to God directly, and not with the intermediaries of church or religion. And the true purpose of religion is to take you there. As Thomas Keating says it so beautifully, the sole purpose of Christianity is transformation into Christ, nothing else. It is a vehicle for facilitating that transformation in you and in me and in each one of us. Well, the religious power structures don't necessarily want that to happen, because then they don't have a job.
Yeah.
So that's one part of it. But there's another part of it also, which is that these are very deep and profound teachings, and they're not they cannot be made fully accessible to someone who's not truly prepared.
Right.
Otherwise, it's even dangerous to give someone too deep a realization at too early a stage. And so the deeper teachings are purposely hidden until one is ready for them. That's one reason that Jesus spoke in parables. In the Bhagavad Gita, the Krishna is told that, I'm sorry, in the Quran, Muhammad is told that when I speak through you about some of these truths, I purposely put veils so that those who are not ready to hear it will not be able to understand it. So there's reasons for it being hidden until the disciple is ready, because the transformation is so radical and so totally profound that one has to be prepared inwardly for it. And then when it comes, one is ready, and one can then actually embody that radical infinity of the Godhead within.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense. I myself went through how shall we call it, a premature
Right.
awakening, and I wasn't quite ready
There's
for
a
it.
term for that.
I wasn't quite ready for it.
Premature immaculation.
Yes, exactly. I wasn't quite ready, and it made it a little difficult to get a grasp of my life, and I guess that would make sense.
It is important, and this is one of the reasons why the traditions are important, because they have although there's been so much corruption and we recognize the abuses of the religious institutions across the board, it's also true that they each contain within them a sacred tradition that actually facilitates this transformation responsibly and with appropriate mentorship and guidance through each of the phases. And that also exists within each of the traditions. And part of the reason I wrote this book is because there's so much criticism of religion and this sort of triumph of science over what is seen as sort of ancient superstition and all of that, which of course is true in many ways. But what's being lost is this sacred, profound, transformative technology of the traditions. That's the baby that's getting thrown out with the bathwater. And not only that, that's the place where all the religions actually meet, is in this mystical transformative journey. And therefore, that can also serve as the much needed bridge to heal the divisions across the religions.
Right, right. And speaking of the religions themselves, I can't help but notice you focused on three main religions: Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism in your book. What was the reason for that?
That's a good point. The primary reason for that is that the book was going to be too long, and I was under significant pressure from the publisher, and appropriate to keep the book from being too long because people already have challenge reading enough material. The second reason was that those are the traditions I know the best, although actually Buddhism is because Buddhism has been a very important part of my own personal path. Um, I do include an appendix on Buddhism and show how it fits into the scheme. And I also, in the book, cite many of the important writings in Judaism that help the Judaism to line up with the points that I'm making in this book. And I was very pleased to see that some of the reviewers have recognized that most of what I say in the book applies to all religions. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to focus particularly on the theistic traditions because of this bias against them now. There's almost a kind of almost a non-dual fundamentalism out there now, which comes out of an overemphasis on the non-dual path of like Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism, which I love dearly. I'm not against it at all. But there has been this kind of sense of non-dual spirituality is the real spirituality and other forms are lesser. And
Right.
non-theistic spirituality has taken ascendancy to the point that God is even a dirty word in places. Well, and we understand why that's true. There's been so much abuse in the name of God.
Yeah.
Whether we call it religious violence or the gender, the false assumption of a masculine gender for God, or God as a warlike tyrant, all of these things. What I'm trying to do is say, I don't deny any of that. All of that is true. What I want to look at is not the dumbest and the dimmest aspects of religion, but the best and the brightest. And when we do that, what emerges is this resplendent path of divine love that we can discern across the religions. And so the point of the book is really to point out what are those strands where they all unite, where they're all calling the soul to this profound union with this absolute and supreme reality, and basically encourage us to rescue, if you will, that sacred thread from the religions while the rest is crumbling and needs to crumble. As you said, we are in the midst of a new awakening. The second axial consciousness, do you know about the first axial consciousness and second axial consciousness that many are proposing, like Uric Cousins and Thomas Berry? I don't know if we should get into that at this moment,
Oh,
but
absolutely. We have about 10 more minutes. By all means, I'm very
well,
curious.
very briefly, the first axial consciousness was a period from about 800 to 300 BC and very focused in intensity in around 550 BC, those few decades when Buddhism emerged, when Zoroastrianism emerged, when many of the religious traditions emerged, and there was a transformation from essentially an earth-based understanding of the divine to a transcendent understanding of the divine. And this happened simultaneously across the human planet in different cultures simultaneously, even though they were not in direct contact with each other. So this was a very remarkable sea change in sort of the spiritual consciousness of humanity. And that is now happening, some are proposing again,
Yeah.
that we are in a second. This was called the first axial transformation. It was named by the theologian philosopher Karl Jaspers, I think a German theologian. And this is now happening again, say, people like Uric Cousins and Thomas Berry and others, that there is a global shift in spiritual consciousness. And part of that shift is that we are seeing for the first time in the human race the unification of the spiritual and wisdom traditions of the world. Each one of them is one of the great treasures of humanity. Each one has been given at a different time and place. And therefore, in that time and place, it was the unique revelation of God in that time and that place. And now what's happening is that the wisdom and the profundity of these traditions are now becoming to be seen as the same. There's a fundamental sameness to the revelation across the traditions. And interestingly, the Quran is being the youngest scripture of them all, of the main religions,
Right.
is the one that actually proclaims this. It actually says that these revelations are all basically the same. And Muhammad is told specifically that nothing was revealed to him that was not revealed before. And in the Islamic tradition, there's a recognition of 124,000 prophets traditionally, and every one of them brought essentially the same message, the same revelation to humanity. So that's kind of the Quranic summary of it. But we see also in the perennial philosophy and in the interspirituality, we see this harmonization, this unity of messages across the religions. And what I'm trying to do is to bring that forward, particularly in the theistic traditions. And so I chose those three. Judaism, I don't have much experience with, but it completely aligns with this. The mystical Kabbalah is completely aligned with what I'm calling the plane of divinity, and the Ein Sof is one with the absolute Godhead. So I see a complete alignment across all of the religions in this framework that I'm putting forward.
I hear here, and I really love the way that you've explained that, because I do feel that there is something very beautiful within all the religions, and unfortunately, like you said, for very good reason, many people have been turned away from it or whatnot. And the whole idea that my way is the only way, if only they would look deeper, they would say it's all the same way, so to speak.
That is correct. And when Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, who is this I that's speaking? It's the Christ that's speaking. And as Panikar said, the great interfaith mystic, he said, Christians do not have a monopoly on Christ. Christ is the name Christians use for supreme reality. Other religions use a different name for that same reality. So when Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and we know it's not Jesus speaking because he says later, I am before Abraham was. Well, before Abraham was, Jesus wasn't around, folks. So
Right.
this I am that he's speaking of refers to the eternal prophetic consciousness, to the universal Christ. It's the same I am that Krishna speaks of at the end of chapter 10 in the Gita, when he says, I when all of this dissolves away, I alone remain. I am, and I run this entire cosmos with the tiniest part of my being. So he's basically making it clear that the physical aspect of the universe is but a tiny part of the fullness of divinity. And all these traditions are taking us into a realization, a direct personal realization in the depths of the heart of that fullness of the infinite divine.
I love it, and I can't help but think about my own path. How, as I began to evolve spiritually, I did study all the religions, like yourself. I got into Buddhism, Judaism, Kabbalah,
Beautiful.
paganism, shamanism, all the isms, and
Yes.
I took what worked for me. And for me, it was about acknowledging that your relationship with your higher self, God, goddess, source, whatever it is you want to call it, is exactly that. It's an individual relationship. Not everyone's going to have the same relationship with the divine that you do. We don't need to have the same relationship, so to speak.
Beautiful. That's beautiful, Bernard, and that's very important. And it's because what I am not doing is trying to blend it all into just one thing. Each of these religions is unique in its diversity and brings a full and rich sacred world to our awareness. So I'm honoring all of these different sacred worlds. It's kind of like the trees in the forest. We honor each one for its incredible uniqueness as a tree, but there's different kinds of trees. Some are tall and thin, some are round, some have perennial leaves, they are evergreens, and others, the leaves die every year. But they're all rooted in the same sacred ground. They all draw from the same hidden waters below, and they all reach vertically upwards to the one light above.
Yeah.
So too with the religions.
Absolutely. And you use this term in your book, the fire of divine love. What is the fire of divine love? I love that saying.
Basically, what I'm saying is that God is a fire. That's even a quote from the Bible. and God is an all-consuming fire. And you find this fire metaphor across the traditions. In the Upanishads, the Nakiceta's fire in the Katha Upanishad, the fire, the cosmic fire that was revealed to Arjuna in chapter 11 of the Gita. The fire, the living flame of love that John of the Cross writes about, oh, living flame of love that swells my heart so tenderly with love. This metaphor of a living fire you find across the traditions. And what it is that it's a fire that burns in the very heart of God and that also burns in each of our hearts. And spiritual practice is nothing other, could be seen, this is metaphorically speaking, but in essence, this is correct. It's basically fanning the flame of that fire in your own heart. And as that happens, what happens? The fire burns away all of the impurities, and then it begins to shine brighter and hotter. And then you become a bearer of that fire yourself. And then what happens is that there are many flames, but only one fire, because you are a flame in this fire, but so is a Buddhist monk practicing somewhere who has this divine fire burning in his heart. He may conceptualize it in terms of Dharmakaya and Dzogchen, but when he or she is totally on fire, if you will, with their living tradition, it's that same flame of divinity burning in them. And what I see is that the different religions are different colors of this flame, and each practitioner is burning with that flame in their heart. And so we have one fire, many flames.
Ah, yes, I love that, and what a great place to end. We're out of time. Let me see if I can share the book cover again, everybody. This is "Belonging to God" by Dr. Will Keepin. And Will, where can they get your book?
They can get my book certainly on the usual channels, on bookstores, Amazon, etc., but also on my website, pathofdivinelove.org. And also my events, upcoming events. We have a retreat here in the Seattle area, first weekend of December, called Heart of the Beloved, where we go into these teachings much more deeply. So www.pathofdivinelove.org.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for a wonderful discussion and a deeper look at, well, the essential aspect of what true divinity is across all the religions. We're not that different, are we?
No, interesting, Liz. We're more alike than we are different.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much, Will. And everybody, don't forget at 3:30 we're going to be back with Hillary Ramo discussing the Dakota Access